Hey, Chris, before we get started today, I want to give a shout out to Jeremy Litchfield, who is our very first Patreon supporter.
That's awesome.
Yeah, shout out to him. Big kudos. Thank you very much for your support.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And I'm Victor Polino.
And you're listening to Civil Dissonance,
a show where we explore, engage, and dissect the topics that divide us as a society.
Today on Civil Dissonance, we'll be discussing
corporate lobbying in America. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
It's good, Victor. You?
I'm doing all right. Well, you know, a little annoyed lately with some of the goings on. I guess it's been going on for a while in our government.
Okay, what's that?
Well, you know, as you know, we're based out of Huntington, West Virginia, and
I do know that.
Yeah, we are in the midst of a drug epidemic.
An opioid crisis?
Yes. And a little while back, there was a report done on the drug epidemic and some of the things that went through Congress that sort of hampered it. And it was a little weird, I have to say. Okay, so basically what ended up happening was the DEA used to be able to suspend strange shipments of opiates to small communities and whatever else, things they thought were suspicious.
Okay. They can't do that anymore?
No. They actually were able to push through Congress. Large pharmaceutical companies were able to push through Congress legislation that stops the DEA from being able to do that.
To freeze suspicious drug shipments?
Shipments, yes. To small community. Well, to corrupt doctors, things like that. And, I mean, that to me seems really, really weird.
Was that just in this past year?
This was actually during the Obama administration.
What?
Yes. And and some of the people who were behind it, some of the people who supported it, obviously were corporate lobbyists. They had massive, massive support.
So who's opposed to it?
Really, I mean, it went through both sides. I think obviously the masses were, and the DEA didn't really like it, but they kind of felt shut out. So, what do you do? So
how does that law benefit the American people?
That I see, it doesn't. But I think it was packaged into we're trying to get drugs to the people who need it. And that was sort of the illusion that was shed. And, of course, what it really did was tie the hands of law enforcement.
The DEA.
The DEA.
Huh. That's interesting.
So that's just like one aspect. This is the thing, is that this was, companies you wouldn't suspect. So like CVS Pharmacy was a huge supplier in the lobbying campaign against this.
Wow.
Yeah, CVS, you don't really think about them as a lobbyist group, but that's the start.
Huh.
Do you have any crazy things going on that you can think of that that are based out by corporate lobbying?
So net neutrality just went away.
Oh, dear Lord.
Yeah. Everybody's talking about net neutrality right now. I'm interested to see what happens, after the effects are known and after everything is put into place to do away with it. Net neutrality was a codification of the FCC. And if you remember from our Fairness Doctrine episode, the Fairness Doctrine was also a codification of the FCC. Everybody was completely against it during its repeal. And, the country isn't in shambles without it. There's not fires burning in the streets. So I'm wondering, with all the talk that happened during the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine and all the talk that's happened prior to the repeal of net neutrality, I'm wondering what will be the after effects. But I'm also wondering, how does the repeal of net neutrality really benefit the American people? Just like the question I asked you with the opioid thing.
Yeah. And who supported it? That's one of the things is like, I haven't talked to a single citizen that I know that supported net neutrality or the repeal of net neutrality.
Yeah, me either. So from what I can gather from reading news reports and news stories, it was either lobbying groups for or direct lobbyists of the big internet service providing companies like Comcast and AT&T.
Oh, the ones who already rule our lives anyway.
They too provide us with the internet.
Yes, and that is life, blood of everything. So I think I don't really understand how corporate lobbying works, come to think of it. I know a bunch of people got some money, a bunch of corporations got some money, and they bribe, I guess is a dirty way of saying it. At least that's what my thought is that they bribe these senators into doing what they want.
Well, campaign contributions are I think, a big part of it.
Yeah.
You remember that joke that went around? I think it was a cartoon that it was talking about corporate lobbying, and it was talking about if our congresspersons wore like NASCAR outfits and they had all their corporate sponsors, for us to see at all times.
That would actually be really cool.
It
Except
would be.
I don't really want to hear them give their little, thank you speeches and stuff at the end of it.
Me either. But it would be nice to have, full transparency.
I think we need to know a little more about this topic.
About corporate lobbying?
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten to this point somehow legally, so we need to figure out what all is involved in it.
I agree.
There's got to be all sorts of little ins and outs that we just don't see.
All right, Victor, I'm going to get on the internet machine. I'm going to go find us somebody.
All right, bring on the expert.
Okay. Today on Civil Dissonance, I'll be speaking with Benjamin Waterhouse. He is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's also the author of Lobbying America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, and The Land of Enterprise. Dr. Waterhouse, thank you so much for being on our show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
For our listeners, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, what you enjoy as a hobby, anything you think our listeners would like to know?
Sure. Well, you sort of gave my professional introduction. I'm a historian of American politics, business, and capitalism, and I teach at the University of North Carolina, where I have taught since 2009. Outside of my professional life, I am the father of 2 active kids of age 9 and 11, so I spend a whole lot of time driving around to baseball and soccer practices and things like that. And, I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Sounds like you're pretty busy.
Yeah.
Can you, for our listeners and ourselves, can you explain to us a little bit about what corporate lobbying is?
Well, sure. Corporate lobbying is just the efforts by businesses to pay somebody to influence someone in government on their behalf. The people that get influenced, that get lobbied, fill a bunch of different types of roles in the government. The most obvious roles are elected officials, lawmakers, both at the state levels and at the national level in American politics. However, lobbyists also work closely with other parts of the government, particularly people like regulators, right? These are folks within the executive branch who are not themselves elected, but who have a great deal of influence over the rulemaking process. That could be everything from when the EPA issues, the Environmental Protection Agency issues standards or regulations of different types or things like that. There are, individual people within those branches who make those calls, and they're also influenced by lobbyists that are paid by corporations.
How about a little bit of the history of corporate lobbying? I know in your book, Lobbying America, the Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, I mean, you do discuss the history of corporate lobbying.
You asked the question in a good way, because it's important to distinguish corporate lobbying from lobbying in general, right? Lobbying in general is a really wide-ranging set of activities, and it has a much longer history. Anytime people have tried to influence someone in power or somebody with some influence over the lives of others, you have an example of lobbying. In history, in American history in particular, corporate lobbying rises along with corporations, which really become a major part of American life in the late 19th century. That's the period. Sometimes we think about things like robber barons, or alternately known as titans of industry, people like Andrew Carnegie, for example, and these big steel mills and big railroad companies and things like that. Those didn't really exist on any sort of size and scale much before about the 1870s. And it's when those corporations really became big business that we start to see corporate lobbying that looks like something sort of recognizable. It changes, of course, over the course of that last 150 years or so. There are times, during what's often called the Gilded Age, that period in the 1870s and 1880s that is associated with a lot of corruption and a lot of malfeasance in politics. And in response to that, there's sort of a pushback and a desire to preserve more democratic processes and more transparency and openness through the early part of the 20th century. So you see that manifest in a lot of different ways. But in the case of lobbying, you see restrictions, for example, on campaign contributions by individuals and by corporations. You also see rules to try to get people to register or declare when they're lobbying on somebody else's behalf.
A lot of our research did kind of open the door to lobbying to us. We understand that lobbying has been something that's been around since the beginning of our country.
Right. And even before. Right.
Yes, definitely. What made corporate lobbying something of interest to you?
Well, I got interested in the sort of history of a particular phase in corporate lobbying, and that was a phase that really got started in the 1970s. Really, between about the 1930s and the 1960s, businesses and business people, in some ways, they kind of accommodated themselves to the government. This is a period in American political history that, is really marked by the New Deal order and the dramatic expansion of the role of the federal government, particularly over regulating things in the economy, but also, addressing and creating a social safety net, strengthening and emboldening workers' unions and things like that from the 1930s onward. And, the 1930s were, of course, the era of the Great Depression, when business in general really got a kind of a black eye in the public mind. People really blamed Wall Street for the crash of 1929, and they blamed unscrupulous big businesses for economic hard times. And as a result, many business leaders kind of pulled back and either kind of went along with the New Deal style of government or just sort of grumbled quietly to themselves. But starting in the late 60s and the early 1970s, by they, I mean, the leaders of major businesses and major business associations started to become much more aggressive and much more kind of coordinated in pushing back in the policy arena and really pushing for what they saw as pro-business and pro-market types of policies. And that's where my story sort of takes off in that book, Lobbying America. I'm really interested in the largest associations that really were at the hallmark of this pushback against kind of liberal New Deal era policies.
That was a lot. and that's fine.
That's right. And that's only the first chapter of the book.
Yeah. Some of the things that I've read have talked about a revolving door, talking with or speaking about politicians becoming corporate lobbyists. Is that something you can speak about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the concept of the revolving door is actually, it's a much more common phenomenon and a little bit after the period I was just describing. So let me back up and then I'll without overloading you too much, try to get around to your question. The period of the 1970s when business really kind of decided to push back was marked by these big associations, things like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that brought together a lot of different business interests. By the 1980s, the Chamber of Commerce still existed and it still exists today. It is, in fact, the biggest spending business organization and individual lobbyist. But a lot more lobbying got professionalized. It became really the province of lobbying firms, which sometimes look like law firms, sometimes they double as law firms. But these are companies that basically exist to take on clients. And what the clients pay for is the access that the lobbying firms provide. Well, how do you get that access? In politics, and in American politics in particular, you get that through personal connections. And what this opens up is the opportunity for people who were formerly inside the government, leaving government service and basically taking a job as an access person, as somebody who has connections because of the people that they know. They can call somebody up on the phone and get a meeting. They can sort of drop in on somebody and they'll talk to them. And they're going to be a lot more effective doing that than just some person, no matter how talented or charismatic they are, who comes in out of nowhere. And that's the concept of the revolving door. that people will frequently leave government service, not necessarily, well, maybe as they were an elected official, or maybe they were a staff member, a highly ranking staffer for somebody on Capitol Hill, for example. The thing about national politics is that there's a salary cap. You can only make so much money, and the salary of a member of Congress is fixed. The salaries of the staff members are limited by law, the same as they are, in the military or any other part of the government. Whereas the salaries that are available to a private person working for a private firm are effectively unlimited. And so there's a tremendous amount of money to be made through that revolving door. And that's been the source of a lot of criticism and efforts at reform, passing either laws or tax policies or other kinds of restrictions to try to limit how much people can, register as lobbyists once they leave government service.
Do you think that there's a bias that might be developing in some legislatures as they're looking toward the end of their career towards some corporate lobbying groups that they might be interested in?
I mean, there's certainly examples of people who've cashed out, and the thing that keeps somebody in office is often not really the monetary reward, but the reward comes in other ways: the power, the influence, the historic prestige of what you're doing. But there are plenty of cases, particularly with your sort of less well-known politicians, where they can make a lot of money and do very well for themselves and set their families up very well by leaving office and going into that revolving door. Okay. Sometimes they leave, not through any desire of their own. They lose an election or there's a scandal and they have to resign, and you'll still see such a person, even if they've been disgraced somehow or lost an election, they've still got the contacts and they still know people within the system. Do you think that is good for America or American businesses? You mean lobbying in general or the revolving door? Well, yeah, I guess I should specify a little bit more. Well, actually, let me start over. Is corporate lobbying good for American businesses? Interestingly, that's not an easy question to answer. And by good for them, the way that people often ask the question is it worth it? They spend a tremendous amount of money on lobbyists. And one of the sort of unanswered questions is whether it pays off. And there's evidence to suggest that it doesn't always pay off, that sometimes companies feel like they need to retain these lobbyists and they need to have sort of a seat at the table, not necessarily because they're really getting particular favors or particular legislation, but because their competitors are doing it. And so they get into this sort of arms race where everybody's paying for it. No one's entirely sure if it's really worth the money. Certainly it can pay off in very specific ways, and that's undeniable. If a certain company gets let's say a government contract, a defense contract, for example, where a very specific amount of money is being allocated and someone's going to get it, if you're the lobbyist who lands that deal, you've done a great job for your clients. There are other places where the policies involved are not as kind of cut and dry. They're broadly something that concerns the business community, but they're not specific to a specific type of company. A lot of the big kind of legislative issues that we talk about, things like healthcare or tax policy, are like that. They affect every type of business in one way or another, but it's not always clear, do they affect everybody the same amount, and who should pay for it? If you were, for example, let's say you're a company that doesn't want to have to have an individual mandate for providing health insurance. Sure, you don't want that, and maybe none of your competitors want that, but which one of you would be hurt more by it? Is it possible that a certain piece of legislation would actually, while hurting you, hurt your competitors even worse? And if that's the case, which side do you lobby on? So it's all very very unclear a lot of the time. Yeah, I can see that. The other question, the revolving door, is the revolving door good for American business? Well, what it does for the businesses is that it gives them a sense that they are involved in the policy process. So it's sort of the same, what it's really good for is the lobbying firms, right? The lobbying firms can command really high retainers and really high fees from their clients because they have these very high profile, famous people, on their payroll. Whether it helps the individual companies or not, I think it's the same question, right? Sometimes lobbying pays off and sometimes it's a waste of money. I think from another perspective, however, it really does hurt the broader society because it gives the impression and often the reality of a corrupt system, right? Of a system where the rich and wealthy kind of retain their wealth by these, underhanded moves, and people who are supposed to be allegedly serving the broader public are really serving the very narrow interests of whoever's paying them.
Speaking about, serving the broader public, especially serving the American worker, unions, as I understand it, used to be had a lot more influence in our legislature.
That's right.
So would you say, or could you talk to us a little bit about whether or not corporate lobbying is good for the American worker?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that sort of happen and build on each other over the course of the second half of the 20th century. American labor, the unions, sort of peaked in membership as a sort of percentage. The number of unionized workers as a percentage of the workforce peaked in the middle of the 1950s and declined after that, and declined particularly rapidly after the 1980s. There are a number of reasons for that decline. The most significant reason is that unionization was strongest in industrial manufacturing. Other types of work, like service work, for example, or agricultural work, were never as strongly unionized as the auto workers or the steel workers or the mine workers and people like that. And it was those types of industries that employ relatively fewer and fewer people over the course of the late 20th century. A lot of that has to do with manufacturing being done in other parts of the world. And a lot of it, probably even more so, has to do with the automation of manufacturing. When you have robots that are building cars instead of UAW guys in Detroit, you have far fewer people in these unions. So unions are declining as a sort of political force on their own. At the same time, especially in the 1970s, that sort of organized business movement that I described at the very beginning, that I wrote about in Lobbying America, actively saw itself as pushing back against organized labor. And it did so under the Nixon administration. It did so briefly under Jerry Ford and under Jimmy Carter. And then particularly once the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, business had for 100 years often defined itself as sort of the opponent of labor in the political realm. But they really start winning in a lot of important ways by the late 1970s. For example, they pushed back against minimum wage increases. They pushed back against rules that would make it easier to unionize a workforce in a given company or a given industry. And on a less kind of obvious level, or in a way that's harder to kind of quantify, they also push this idea that unions are not in keeping with a spirit of free competition and free enterprise, that people ought to have the right to freely negotiate for their work and their labor and their wages at the individual level. And that's the way sort of market capitalism would have it, whereas unions represent something that is collectivized, that's, sort of socialistic, that's corrupt, potentially criminal. People talk about some of the connections between organized crime and organized labor. And through all of those things, they sort of, this organized business lobbying helps weaken labor unions in the political arena. And, I think from the perspective of workers tend historically to do better when they can organize collectively, when they can say, hey, we want a bigger slice of this company's profits. We want more, we want higher wages, we want better conditions, and so forth. So to the extent that corporate lobbying has focused on the corporate bottom line, a lot of that, I think, has come at the expense of the workers.
With the deunionization, have you heard of the right to work laws?
Yes.
Okay. So, to me, as Joe everybody, when I see that, it gives me a positive feeling. When I look at that
phrase, right to work.
Yeah, right to work. But when you look into it, can you explain that?
Yeah. So it's a right to work law is a law that a state legislature passes that basically says that a company cannot sign a contract with a union that requires the company to only hire union people. The right to work in this case is the right to work even if you don't pay the dues to the union. And so, if you take a sort of stereotypical unionized industry from the 1930s or 40s, say I have a car manufacturing plant, and the United Auto Workers wants to come in and be the representative of the union, traditionally, or in the, say, the 1930s and 40s, I, as the manager of the company, would sign a contract with the UAW that says, I'm going to hire UAW workers, members, to be my workers. The right to work law says that contract can't happen. That doesn't mean that a unionized worker can't work for my company. It just means that I cannot make that a condition of their employment. Effectively, what that does is it gives the worker very little incentive to join the union or to pay the dues if they don't have to. And the effect of it is that fewer workers want to join the unions. Unions work, effectively when they have lots of people working together. If a union of one isn't very powerful, right? If you threaten to quit your job because you want a higher salary and you're the only one who's threatening to quit, well, the company's just going to let you quit. Yeah. Right. But if everybody at the company threatens to quit unless they get a salary increase, then the management will pay more attention. And the people who promoted right to work laws starting in the 1940s really pushed that language. And they did, the reason that you have the reaction that you do to it is because they did it very deliberately to stress the individual right to contract for one's own labor, which serves the interest of the corporation that wants to sort of limit people from joining unions. It's the reason that unionization in the South, for example, is so much weaker than in parts of the North and the Midwest. Recently, some of those states have also started to adopt right to work laws, but for most of the period since the 1940s, when this all started, it was Northern industrial and Midwestern industrial states that were heavily unionized and places in the South that did not. And those are the states that passed right to work laws in the 1940s.
I actually did not know that the right to work laws had started in the 1940s, so I appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah. It's a law called the Taft-Hartley Act that permitted it reformed an earlier piece of labor legislation that allowed individual states to pass these laws. And for a long time, it was pretty static. Like right away, all these southern states, for the most part, passed right to work laws, and the northern industrial states did not because of the strength of organized labor. It's only been in the last couple of years that you've seen, the last maybe 10 years, that you've seen places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio talk about, right, and in some cases enact right to work laws.
Would you say you are for or against corporate lobbying?
Well, I try not to come down on it either way because I think it's a fact of life in a democracy. One of the funny things about lobbying is if you read it a certain way, it's actually the right to do it is enshrined in the Constitution. The very First Amendment protects the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances, which basically says that people have the right to communicate with their elected officials. And, viewed from a certain perspective, that's what lobbying is, whether it's done by a nonprofit organization, whether it's done by an individual, or whether it's done by a company. As a result, there's really never been a realistic push to prohibit it. It's not even clear what it would look like to get rid of lobbying. Are you supposed to follow around your members of Congress all day long and make sure they never talk to anybody? It's kind of unrealistic. The other problem is that lobbying, and most members of Congress will, admit to some version of what I'm about to say, it provides a service that they could not possibly do on their own. The modern American government and everything that it touches is so complicated. The issues and the details are so complex that you could not reasonably expect 1 out of 100 senators or 1 out of 435 members of Congress and their relatively small staffs to keep up with it all. They wouldn't know what the consequences of a given piece of legislation would be. And so they depend on outsiders to explain, and provide information, provide data, provide studies, to help them make those decisions. So from those perspectives, it's a necessary, not only an unavoidable, but even a necessary part of governance. The challenge is how do you, sort of have a political system where lawmakers are getting fair and equal information from a variety of perspectives. If they're only hearing from one constituency or from one group, whether it's a corporation or something like the gun lobby or some other issue group, the environmental group, something, whatever it is, if they're only hearing that one side, then their votes are all going to be pretty consistent. And, in a way, that's a whole other set of issues. The issue there isn't really the lobbying. It's the interest of the lawmaker himself or herself in finding out, what the best policies are going forward. So it's a way of dodging your question that I don't see it as something that's, I don't think it makes any sense to be pro or against, but I certainly think that it's something that needs to be better understood. And, if we're going to start getting serious about how to promote, maybe a more, greater dialogue among lawmakers or greater willingness to compromise, I think frankly, I think there are better places to start than worrying about the lobbying. I think the fact that most lawmakers spend the vast majority of their time raising money to run for office again is probably a bigger problem. And because they spend so much of their time trying to raise the money necessary to stay in their jobs, they tend to listen to the people who are writing the checks. And when those are lobbyists, or when those are what are called bundlers, people who kind of go out and find a bunch of donors to all give the maximum to a certain candidate, that's the thing that's really kind of restricting, I think, political options and restricting people from making compromises or broadening their horizons more than the actual act of lobbying itself.
Okay, so lobbying itself, I understand that is something that we need to have. That is something that is protected by the Constitution. Specifically corporate lobbying. And what I mean by that is, I read an article, and I might be misquoting. I'm very good at that, misquoting articles. But one article I read said that there were 16 lobbyists for the healthcare industry to every one legislator.
Yeah, and that honestly doesn't surprise me, and it's actually not all that many people. If each one of those people were trying to explain how a provision of a proposed healthcare law would affect somebody, and they each had to be an expert in one very small part of that bill, then you can see that as a conveying information. If each one of those people's job is to just sort of bully and badger the member of Congress to vote their way, then they're not really contributing to a debate or anything productive. They're just sort of, blindly pushing a corporate line. So, you're making a distinction between sort of whether corporations should be doing this lobbying or whether it should all be done by individuals. And I think that the challenge is that there's really no obvious way to prevent this. And in the history of lobbying, there are often attempts to do it. The most common thing that people do is, require lobbyists to declare themselves, to register. But there are also sometimes ridiculous and comical limitations that are put on lobbying. Famously, there was something a few years ago where, a member of Congress was not allowed to receive a meal from a paid lobbyist. The idea was if you can't take them out to dinner, wine them and dine them, and buy them a nice steak, and then try to pressure them to vote a certain way. So that was prohibited. But the law was written in such a way that it said a sit down meal was the thing that was prohibited. A cocktail party where everyone's standing up and walking around was going to be okay. And the result was you had people all over Washington, D.C. Having steak dinners where they wouldn't sit down. And so they're all standing around trying to cut steak and drink wine without sitting. And you can imagine how silly and ridiculous this was, because obviously the spirit of the law was being ignored when they were following it to the letter.
Yeah, I'd read many things that had talked about that. It is very hilarious. Just a few more questions. In your experience, researching your books and just working on your PhD, do you see a correlation between the rise in corporate lobbying, deunionization, and the rise in the wealth gap?
There's certainly a correlation in that they all sort of happened at the same time. The wealth gap in America is really one of the biggest puzzles for scholars and historians, and as well as policymakers. And there's a lot of things that go into it, and people argue about, what the relative role of different things is. How much of it is tax policy? How much of it is unions themselves? If unions are not strong and pushing up wages, then wages tend to stagnate, but corporate profits are not. And therefore, the people who are making money from the corporate profits are getting richer. People who are making money from labor are not. That's a big part of it. And so to a degree, a lot of those policy things are wrapped up in the growing strength of corporations, and in a bigger political sense, that sort of pro-business, pro-free market mindset. The idea that there shouldn't be rules and regulations, that there shouldn't be a strong welfare state. These are all part of the same sort of political project. So I do think that, we can see the origins of all of these things in the 1970s and into the 1980s, which are, often remembered as the sort of pushback against a more liberal, welfare state-oriented model of politics and toward a much more conservative, business-oriented and free market type of politics.
Last question. Is there anything about corporate lobbying you think that we haven't covered that you feel that our listeners should know?
Boy.
I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing, and I think but the point I made before about the kind of connection between the financing of campaigns and the lobbying is something that's important to kind of keep straight. Lobbying is not always, somebody browbeating somebody else to vote a certain way. It can be a lot more effective and a lot more sort of bang for your buck if you can get somebody into office as a lawmaker who already agrees with you. And this is one of the challenges of, sort of putting all the focus on lobbying. You're kind of removing the focus from the people who are in power in the first place. Members of Congress frequently say, I didn't vote a certain way because somebody gave me this money. They gave me the money because I vote their way. And what that's telling you is that it's really about the views and the perspectives and the agenda of the individual lawmakers. If that's the person that if that's the thing that you disagree with, for example, then the thing to do is not worry about who's lobbying them, but worry about that person themselves, what groups they represent, what party they're from, and so on. So I think, there is a danger of sort of focusing too much on lobbying as though lawmakers themselves are just sort of, bending with the wind and willing to vote whatever way, whoever, pressures them. For the most part, and certainly in today's politics, the politics of the last 10, 15 years or so, most politicians in national politics are kind of set in their ways, and they follow their party leadership, and they're going to vote how they're going to vote. There's very little switching around. The recent efforts, for example, to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act are a good example of that. Out of 100 senators, 98 are spoken for, and we only focus on the 2 who go one way or the other.
I appreciate that answer. I think I want to say a lot of people feel that politicians kind of sway in the way of their lobbyists, those that are contributing to their campaigns. I'm not saying that that's what it is, but I kind of feel that that's a way a lot of the American people view it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think, it's worth, I think it makes sense, in an interesting way, especially when it comes to your own politician, your own representative. People tend to have a relatively favorable view of them, and they might kind of tend to write off a vote they disagree with for the reasons that you said. I like this person, but I think they voted that way because they were pressured or because that was who was funding their campaign. And so that might be part of it. But, it matters, ultimately, who folks are listening to. And so it's not that, the corporate lobbying doesn't matter. In fact, it does matter a lot. I guess my point is that it matters just as much, if not more, what role they play in getting people elected than it does what they do once they're in office. If that makes sense, the actual, leveraging of lawmakers.
Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, I don't have any more questions for you. So
all right.
I really appreciate your time.
Oh, man, it's my pleasure.
All right, listeners, that was Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse, a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Don't forget to get on Amazon and check out his books, Lobbying America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, and The Land of Enterprise. You can follow Dr. Waterhouse on Twitter at BC Waterhouse. That's at BC Waterhouse. We'll have links to his books and links to his Twitter in our show notes. Stay tuned after the musical break for our wrap-up with Victor and myself.
If you like what you hear, you can help us out by funding our efforts and keeping the show ad-free.
You can do that by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance or by following the link on our website and in our show notes.
You can also show support to our guests by purchasing their books and other works. You can find a list with links on our website under Guest Works.
Okay, so that was our interview with Benjamin Waterhouse. And Victor, did you know? Well, I know you know, but I'm going to let our listeners know because they probably figured it out. But he actually had to get into his car and drive away from his house because his cell reception wasn't so great. So that was awesome. I really can't believe he did that, and it was very appreciated.
We can't thank him enough for doing that. That was amazing.
Yeah. So what have you taken from this interview?
Well, one of the first things that stands out to me that he mentioned was that it's not just the senators who are influenced by corporate lobbying. There's, all kinds of people who are involved in government, heads of different departments, the EPA and whatever else, who are also influenced. And then they help shape the policies. And that really kind of struck me. This isn't just, at least I used to think of it just as the senators were being bribed and whatever else. But there's so much more to that.
And representatives. Don't forget about the representatives.
And representatives. I'm sorry. Poor representatives. They're so forgotten. But I think that also opens the concept for how they do that, how they're influenced.
Okay. So, so lobbyists talk to all persons in government to try to either have a law passed or to shape policy in different departments. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And part of me wonders about what they get out of it. The senators get reelected. So what do the other guys get out of it?
Okay, so
what are these people that are heading these departments or working these departments? What's coming for them?
Okay.
Because they got to have something in the mix that's going to help influence them,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And of course, it's not always corruption. That's something else we found out was that this is part of the regular process. So, these guys these lobbyists, they're bringing knowledge to them, but it's not always, with corporate lobbying, it's a little different, right? Because he was saying there's a difference between corporate lobbying and regular lobbying.
In the history of. Yeah, but lobbying in itself is lobbying.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the points he was trying to impress upon us, that you can't delineate or differentiate corporate lobbying from me trying to talk to my senator, because it's all protected under the Constitution. Lobbying is lobbying is lobbying.
Yeah. What I found was interesting is that corporate lobbying I think he was trying to say that it arose during the robber baron age, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
I think he was talking about that corporate lobbying came about with the rise of corporations. So when corporations started gaining influence and power in America, so did corporate lobbying begin.
Yeah. The rise of big business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think with with that, you have the downside where you had the Depression ring about. That's kind of what I gathered he was saying.
You mean the Great Depression?
Yeah. I think where they sort of had where he was saying that they just sort of, they sat down and they did speak. They were like that uncle that says things at your table that you just don't want them to say. And so you finally call them out and they just sit in the corner and kind of pout. And I think that's what kind of emerged.
Yeah. But we also had, the New Deal era, the rise in government influence over most Americans' lives.
Yeah. The public was tired of the big business aspect, and they blamed them for the economy, right? And that's what he was kind of saying. And they just sort of there until the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And they were like, well, wait, we're not expanding anymore or whatever. And they stood back up and they started working their thing.
Yeah. Revolving door, Victor. Tell me what you gathered about revolving doors.
I kind of gathered that this is where people are.
Is it where, they walk in and, they don't have to pull anything? They just kind of push and keep walking. But if they don't let go, they'll just walk back outside.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking it was the scene from, it was like Superman where he would just go through and change a suit and fly back out. No, I don't think that's it at all. I think the revolving door deals with the way people make money and find jobs after their political careers.
Okay.
And not just the senators, right?
No, I imagine it would be, anybody in government, but anybody can be, well, I don't want to say anybody can be a lobbyist, but if you meet the qualifications, I guess you can be a lobbyist.
Yeah, and I think the qualifications were part of it.
Corporate lobbyist.
For corporate lobbyists.
Yeah, anybody can be a lobbyist.
Yeah. But, well, and still, I mean, one of the things that struck me was the concept that these people have assumed were in positions of power, and then they can just carry their allegiance, the history that they have, the people that they knew, and they can use that as influence.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes if it isn't the objective of some of our government officials to get into office, stay there to get their pension, which for persons in Congress, it's only 5 years. So after you do 5 years, you have your pension. So if a senator does their term before their reelection comes up, that's 6 years. They've already got their pension. So they can move on to a lobbying firm after that with their pension, and now they're receiving a larger paycheck. So again, I wonder if some of our elected representatives, if that is their intention.
Well, I mean, even if it isn't, it's such a massive open door that, it's like, hey, I can have my cake and I can eat it too,
So with, the legislators doing this revolving door thing, they're taking care of themselves. I know Dr. Waterhouse talked about deunionization. So we have our legislators that are doing this revolving door thing. They're taking care of themselves. And we've had this huge deunionization throughout the last couple decades, and now the American workers not being taken care of.
Well, I remember him saying that workers fared better when they could stand collectively, but as we move away from deunionization, and big business is basically the only ones that get to sit at the table, are starting to be the only ones that can sit at the table. So there's not really a counter voice there anymore.
No, or with corporate lobbying, corporations now have the voice, and with deunionization, the American worker really doesn't. So we're at the will of corporations now without a voice in Congress.
Yeah, and you'd brought up the right to work laws in the interview.
Yeah,
and that is sort of like legislation is specifically leading to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's making it worse and worse for us not to be able to sit down. I think it's important for our listeners and for us to understand that despite it all, corporate lobbying is all part of our constitutional background. And
what's a right?
Yeah, it's a right. It's covered in the First Amendment.
Yeah, protected under the First Amendment.
And with that, you have the unfortunate side of it, which is corporate lobbying. But, it's all part of there. It's just important, as with all the things I think that we do, is to hold our government accountable.
Yes, and I believe that was one of the things that Dr. Waterhouse had said was one way for us to fix any negative feelings that we might have about corporate lobbying is to hold our elected officials accountable. So if we don't feel that they're enacting legislation that protects us as United States citizens or might be benefiting corporations and not us as citizens, then we need to do something about that. And I think one of the things we can do about that is not reelect them.
Yeah, vote them out of office and petition them.
Yeah.
So, I think we just have to scrape off the ick of corporate lobbying and realize that it's going to be there.
Yeah. Is this draining the swamp that I've heard? Is that what that is?
Yeah, it's draining the swamp, but it's not going to be from anybody in office.
No.
So it's going to have to come from the American people.
Yeah. We'd like to give a special thanks to Stu Art and Design for our show's logo and to Kiko's Last Smile for the music you've heard during the show.
We would also like to thank our guests for their time and insight, and a thank you to our listeners. Without you, this isn't possible.
Show your support by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance and head over to our website for a full listing of our episodes, transcripts, and more information about our guests and other supporters.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Links are in the show notes and on our website.
And if you're so inclined, leave us a review on iTunes. And if you like what you've heard, tell people about us. I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And I'm Victor Polino, and you've been listening to Civil Dissonance, a Pro Thoughts production.
Now go out and start a conversation. Oh, one last note. If you have an idea for a show or you have comments, please shoot us an email at info@civildissonance.com or leave it in a comment on our website under the episode. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I liked it.